Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Research Colloquium today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vivek Dey. Dr. Vivek Dey earned his BTech degree at IIT Madras and his PhD at RPI. He is both an Intel Fellow as well as an IEEE Fellow. He's currently the Director of Circuit Technology Research at Intel Labs, where he provides technical insight and direction into long-term research into future circuit technologies, as well as energy-efficient hardware design across sort of the design stack from devices all the way up to the system level. He's written a whole bunch of patents, I think over 30 patents, over 200 publications, and continues to remain very closely involved both technically and organizationally in some of the top venues in our field of integrated circuits and systems, at Symposium, ICE-SCC, and the Journal of Solid-State Circuits. Please welcome Dr. Dey.
Thank you, Visvesh. Can you guys hear me? Okay. All right. It's a pleasure to be here. As we all know, energy efficiency is becoming one of the most important challenges for all computing platforms, all the way from your handheld devices, wearable devices, to the biggest supercomputer or data centers you can think of. So it's not just about reducing energy consumption of these platforms. It's also about delivering the performance, delivering the user experience, delivering the expectations of the consumers while minimizing the energy consumption in the process. And that's a harder problem to address than simply minimizing energy consumption at any cost. So I'll talk today about some of the challenges and opportunities for research, primarily in the circuit design side, but also cover some of the aspects of full system design, including hardware and software, for achieving the goal of extreme energy efficiency in the future. So we want to achieve what I call extreme energy efficiency by the end of this decade. And what that means is that you want to have a compute capability of hundreds of gigaflops, which is floating point operations per second, within your handheld device. And at the same time, you want to achieve an exaflop level of performance in your biggest supercomputer or data center. So one exaflop is 10 power 18. And if you look at the biggest supercomputer today, the fastest one, that's the one in China. It's called the Tianhe 2 machine. And that achieves about 33.86. They measure this in second decimal places for good reason. 33.86 petaflops, which is 10 power 15 floating point operations per second. That's the best we can do today. And to do that, the whole supercomputer consumes about 20 megawatts, or 24 megawatts to be precise. Now, that's clearly not going to work if you want to scale that up to an exaflop. So the why 20 megawatts is a limit, people ask. It's because one nuclear reactor can generate about 20 megawatts. So you can think of your supercomputer coming attached with a nuclear reactor, and having two of them is not cost-effective or practical. So we have a big challenge in achieving this level of energy efficiency. So huge performance under severe energy constraint for all devices, all computing platforms, ranging from the smallest one to the biggest one you can think of. So today, we are about 2 orders of magnitude away from getting there. So if we look at the best supercomputer, the best smartphone today, we are about 100x off in terms of that level of energy efficiency which we want to achieve. So we have 100x more to go, which translates to about 20 picojoule per flop level of energy efficiency by the end of this decade. And the techniques we develop for getting there are going to apply for a variety of computing platforms. It's not just for the phone, it's not just for the tablet or the PC, it's also for the big data centers and the supercomputers. So there's a commonality in terms of the type of techniques you have to come up with, both across hardware and software. Hardware is important, but that's not everything. You have to worry about software as well to achieve at a system level this kind of energy efficiency. And it's not just about the silicon. It's not just about the microprocessor SoC. If you look at the breakdown of a Xeon server system today, that delivers about 100 gigaflops under 200 watts. If you look at where does the energy go in that server system, 10 watts out of 200 watts goes into compute. the microprocessor and the different compute building blocks you have on your chip. 15 watts goes to the memory subsystem, the DRAMs and the other memories that you have. 10 watts goes to storage, flash and other storage devices in the system. 10 watts goes to communications, which is all the data center wide or rack to rack or chip to chip interconnects to move data around. That consumes about 10 watts. And believe it or not, the remaining 155 watts goes into cooling and power delivery. So what comes at the edge of your data center into the building, most of it is lost by the time it gets to the final server machine for all the power conversions you have. You have AC to DC, DC to AC, uninterrupted battery storage, power supply. All of these conversions and distributing these currents and the voltages all across a big system, that consumes a huge amount of energy and losses in there. So that's a big amount we have to worry about. Then cooling. Most data centers employ some kind of air conditioning or liquid circulating through the data center to really cool all these huge machines. And that consumes a humongous amount of power in making sure the systems run at the required temperature. So out of this 200 watts budget at the system level, which includes power delivery and cooling, most of it is not available for computing. And there's no way you can get to an exaflop under 20 megawatts with this kind of a system. So in the future, we have to come up with systems that have half a watt for compute, half a watt for memory and storage together, half a watt for all the interconnects and communications, and half a watt for the losses in cooling and power delivery. So that's the only way we can get to 200 gigaflops and 100 gigaflops under 2 watts, which translates to about exaflop under 20 megawatts. So focusing on the silicon, making it more efficient is an essential step, but it's not sufficient. So we have to look at it holistically at a system level, both hardware and software, all components of the system to achieve this kind of extreme energy efficiency in the future. One of the key driving forces of our continuing march in improving energy efficiency and performance has been Moore's Law. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Moore's Law, where you scale the process technology, the silicon process technology on which you implement all these chips and SoCs, by 30% reduction in feature size every generation, a couple of years or so. So that allows two things to happen. One is that you get a lot more transistors, which are smaller, cheaper, and better in some ways. Having smaller and cheaper transistors allows you to integrate a lot more features or components of the computing platform into a smaller form factor. So that really makes computing much more affordable in different small form factors and even in data centers. The second sort of a collateral effect that happens is that now the data movement cost across different components is reduced because they're much closer together. So it takes much less energy to move data from across short distances than across longer distances. So by allowing more integration of components on a chip or into multiple chips, in a closer distance, in a closer form factor, a smaller form factor, you're reducing the energy efficiency of data movement indirectly. So that really also helps improving the energy efficiency every time you scale the process technology and re-implement all the components in a smaller process. Now, the march towards Moore's Law scaling has been going on pretty much unabated for the last 50 years. In fact, I think next week is the 50th anniversary of the Moore's Law, and we'll all celebrate that. The entire industry will celebrate that. There are major challenges to keep doing that for for until the end of this decade and next decade. There are major technical challenges, business challenges for doing that, but the entire industry is behind it. It's one of those things that's so economically profitable and viable that it justifies the investment the entire industry is making to continue along this path. And it also helps, as I mentioned, energy efficiency along the process. So today we are shipping in Intel and some of the other companies what we call FinFET or Tri-Gate devices, which are three-dimensional transistors that have better short channel effects and other good properties. We see a clear path to going at least 2 more generations beyond this, including device and materials innovations. And that's a critical part of our march towards extreme energy efficiency. Now, there'll be a few other things at a platform level that will become more and more prevalent, and some of this is already happening. So we need a much more fine-grained platform power control for achieving the kind of efficiencies we're looking at in the future. If you look at SoC or a system in a package You have different components in that platform. You have the compute cores. You have a different level of cache memory hierarchy. You have a scalable on-die interconnect fabric to support seamless communication, efficient communication between the cores and the cache. You have some accelerators, fixed function accelerators like graphics or video accelerators. You have special purpose functions or engines like encryption or image processing that the platform needs. You have a controller for connecting to off-die memory, and you have controllers for I/O, for the different I/O devices that you need to connect to. So a complex platform like this needs to have certain features for fine-grained dynamic power control. First of all, you need to have ability to control different parts of this platform, the different building blocks, independently for voltage and frequency. Because depending on what workload is running at any point of time, you don't need all of them to be operating at the highest performance. So you need to have independent control of the different regions of the platform, the different building blocks, so that you can set the voltage frequency operation point based on what's running at that point of time and what kind of workload you're running on that. The second thing is that you need to have scenario-based power allocation. And what I mean by that is you have a fixed power budget for the platform. Let's say 10 watts or 20 watts, what have you. So within that fixed power envelope, you want to maximize the performance of a certain building block depending on what is running on it at that point of time. For example, if you have a graphics-intensive workload running, you don't need to allocate much of the power budget to the CPU because that's not doing much. Most of the power budget needs to be allocated to the graphics block so that it can perform at the best efficiency and provide the demand of the workload. So shifting around the power budget intelligently, smartly, autonomously among the different parts of a platform is critical for delivering the performance that you need, the user experience that you need within a fixed power envelope. We have DVFS, dynamic voltage frequency scaling, which is clearly very important because not all the time you need to be operating at the highest frequency. Then we also need to be able to shut down and reactivate different parts of the platform quickly, very efficiently on the fly, because you don't need all parts to be working all the time. So a combination of these capabilities in our platforms are critical to really deliver the best user experience, the best performance, while maximizing energy efficiency and making sure we are working within the constraints of platform power delivery and cooling. Often we set our voltage frequency operating points for the different components based on some worst case assumptions. And what I mean by that, we assume that the environment in which this platform will be operating is always the most pessimistic you can imagine. You assume that there's a lot of voltage drop, there is a high temperature all the time. We assume there is aging happening of these components, even at the beginning of life, and set the voltage frequency targets or the operating points based on the assumption that all these environmental changes are going to be present in the worst possible way all the time. Clearly, that's not the case. Clearly, many times the temperature is not as high. Many times you don't have a lot of voltage drop or power noises in your device. So another way to address this is that if you think about the platform being self-aware, it's aware of the environment in which it's operating, and it sets its operating point based on the current condition. So that way, on an average, you're able to improve the efficiency because most of the time, this worst case condition is not present, and you're not leaving a lot of performance and efficiency on the table. So having an adaptive and reconfigurable platform, which has sensors on die or in the platform that tracks changes in temperature, changes in voltage droop, changes in activity or power supply current, changes in aging-related degradations, and automatically feeds that information to a control unit, which sets a voltage frequency target appropriately at that point of time, depending on the operating conditions. So if you also change workloads, different things are running on the platform, then you can also reconfigure the different building blocks to be optimal for that particular workload. So having this dynamic adaptation and reconfiguration to make sure you're operating at the best power performance point all the time without making assumptions about worst case situations ahead of time is really going to be important for achieving this extreme energy efficiency in the future. You can push beyond that. So when you adapt and reconfigure to sort of deal with these environmental changes, you are still assuming that you have to work or you have to operate error-free. Now, if you allow errors to occur infrequently, meaning that if you push the voltage too low or if you allow the frequency to go a little too high, beyond what the error-free operation dictates, then you can push this efficiency envelopes a little further as long as you make sure that those errors that may occur are not visible to the user. They do not impact the system performance at a high level significantly. So to do that, you have to have certain features in your platform, certain capabilities. You have to be able to detect errors. You have to be able to diagnose the source of the error, confine it so that it doesn't propagate to the rest of the system. You have to have mechanisms for error correction, error recovery for the system, and then adapt a system, reconfigure it based on the future workloads or future expected events for that platform. If you look at the hardware and software stack for a complex system, you have circuit and design level techniques, you have microarchitecture techniques, you have system software, firmware implementations, you have programming system and applications. So you need to incorporate all these mechanisms for error detection, recovery, adaptation, reconfiguration at the appropriate level in this hardware to software stack. For example, it's better to detect errors at a very low level in circuits or in microarchitecture because you can't afford to miss too many errors that are actually occurring out there, and because that can create problems. But responding to the error doesn't need to happen at the circuit or microarchitecture level because many of these errors are not significant, meaning that if you have a memory bit that flipped or became dysfunctional, it may not be used by the program at all, and so it doesn't impact any system level or program level functionality or performance. So you can simply ignore that error. And that level of visibility into which errors are important or not are really clearer at a higher level in this hardware-software stack. So at a system OS level or virtual machine level or the programming systems level, you have much more capability of figuring out which errors are important, which errors are not. So implementing these techniques at the right level is very important. As you go up the stack, your effective error rate goes down very quickly because, as I said, many of the errors are really not important for overall system functionality or performance. So you can afford to ignore them, which allows you to have a larger response time or larger recovery response because the errors are so infrequent. So implementing the error tracking responses at higher level in the stack is more optimal. And having the error detection at the lower level, at the circuit or microarchitecture level is really more optimal. So you have to figure out how to implement all of these techniques from detection to reconfiguration across this hardware and software stack most effectively and optimally so that you maximize your performance, efficiency, and reliability of the entire system. More and more of these kind of techniques are going to be useful and prevalent in the future platforms. Now I want to talk about the design of the different components or compute building blocks. So if you look at the voltage frequency characteristic of a design or a chip or a compute building block, you have high frequency at high voltage and low frequency at low voltage. So at the high end, you want to operate the maximum frequency possible, and you're limited by 3 things to be able to do that. Number 1, the reliability of the transistors and the on-die interconnects. So your transistors cannot handle a voltage beyond a certain point because they either break down or degrade severely at high voltage stress. Your interconnects cannot handle too much current beyond a certain point because they have electromigration and stress migration kind of failures. So the maximum voltage and current that your transistors and interconnects can tolerate dictates the highest voltage frequency you can use that chip for. Next is thermals. So you cannot afford to heat up the chip beyond a certain point because of reliability concerns. And your package die interface cannot go through too many stressful thermal cycles before they degrade. So the cooling of your platform, the thermal limits of your platform dictate what's the highest voltage frequency you can operate at. And finally, power delivery. To supply large currents at low voltage or even nominal voltage, you have to worry about supply noises and voltage droops. And that's dictated by your voltage regulator, your power delivery network. So that limits how much current you can pump into a particular chip during operation. So these 3 limits together dictate how fast you can operate, at what's the highest voltage corresponding to that frequency you can use. Now, people think that sometimes wrongly that operating at a high voltage frequency is not necessarily energy efficient. That's not true in all cases. For example, often it's much more efficient to finish some job very fast, running at high voltage frequency, and then shut it down for the rest of the time before the next workload arrives. So as opposed to continuously working at low voltage frequency during the entire time. So depending on the behavior of the workload, you really need to have a power management feature that can leverage the high voltage frequency point effectively to reduce the overall power consumption of the chip, of the platform. So targeting high voltage frequency is not only important for performance reasons, to respond to something very quickly, a burst mode kind of performance, it's also important for some cases for power management, making sure that overall you're consuming much less energy than other ways. The more critical challenges for this designing for this wide voltage frequency range comes at the low end. So many times your workload is not performance critical, so you want to run at low frequency to save energy and power. You want to reduce the voltage along with the frequency to save energy. Sometimes you have highly parallel workloads, so it's more efficient in that case to run it across multiple blocks in parallel and operate all the blocks at low voltage and frequency. So in two ways you can utilize the low voltage frequency operating point for energy efficient performance. Now, as you lower the frequency, you have to lower the voltage to get the energy efficiency. Just lowering frequency without reducing voltage is not very useful. And the certain limits you encounter, certain obstacles you encounter from a design perspective as you try lowering voltage, as you lower frequency. The first one is that at lower voltage, your signal to noise ratio is essentially less, because your signal is the voltage level and the noise are all the variations and other noises that you have in the system. So your SRAM bits, static RAM bits on your die, they are the smallest, they're the most plentiful on a die. They have lots of mismatches and variations from process side. So they are the ones that fail first as you start lowering voltage. After that, the register files, the ROMs, the flip-flops and latches, and the logic circuits eventually, they fail because of variation-induced noises and other dynamic noises. So that limits how low a voltage you can go to, even if you're willing to lower the frequency of operation. Second is soft errors. So you have cosmic ray-induced soft errors that are there in the environment. So you have to make sure that your voltage is not so low that you have lots of soft errors triggered by cosmic rays. Alpha-induced errors are gone away pretty much these days because we use lead-free package. So we don't have too much of a strong alpha source near our chip in our packages. Beyond that, there is a phenomenon called frequency roll-off, steep frequency roll-off. So as you take the supply voltage very close to the threshold voltage of the transistor, what happens is that you enter the subthreshold region of the device, where the current drops off exponentially as you reduce voltage a little bit. So as you enter that region, for slight reduction in voltage, you have a huge loss in speed, huge reduction in frequency. That essentially says that even if you're willing to reduce frequency a lot, you can't reduce voltage too much because you're in this exponential roll-off region. And that sort of is the ultimate limiter on how low a voltage you can go to, even if you're willing to reduce the frequency by a lot. By changing device structure, for example, going from a planar bulk MOSFET to a FinFET or Tri-Gate kind of device, you can improve that phenomenon, because a Tri-Gate or FinFET device has a much steeper subthreshold characteristic, which means for a target leakage current, you can target a smaller threshold voltage for the device, which means this phenomenon of lowering voltage and corresponding frequency roll-off can happen at a lower voltage because you'll be approaching the threshold voltage at a lower value for this kind of devices. So having Tri-Gate, FinFET kind of devices are really helpful for pushing out this frequency roll-off effect at lower and lower voltages by optimizing the devices. And finally, you have aging-induced degradations. At the transistor's age, their threshold voltage increases. They become slower. Now, in an SRAM cell, all the transistors in the cell don't age in the same way, which means that it creates differential mismatches and in threshold voltage as different transistors in the cell age differently. And that can create a functionality problem for SRAM cells as they age during the lifetime of the operation of the processor. So these four things together really limit how low a voltage you can go in a reasonable, reliable way, and what's the range of operation you can afford for voltage and frequency. One of the disturbing things is that as we scale technology, process technology, the difference between the Vmin, the minimum voltage you can reliably operate at, and the Vmax, the highest voltage you can reliably operate at, that range is shrinking because more variations in the process lift the Vmin, increase the Vmin, and as the dielectric and the fields become higher in the transistor, the highest voltage you can go to also is reducing somewhat. So from both sides, you're getting sort of squeezed in maintaining this wide enough range of operations. So you have to invoke new techniques, primarily at the circuit and design level, on top of process optimizations to really make sure that this range doesn't shrink too much. Having this wider range is really important for power management because you never know what kind of workload you will get, and you never know where you need to be operating at optimally. So having a wide range of operation available to you at a platform level is really critical for improving the energy efficiency overall of the system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different Vmin failure limits and how do we address them for DSRAM, register file, and the logic computing building blocks. If you look at the SRAM array, as you lower the voltage of operation for that array, the number of bits that fail goes up. It goes up sort of slowly in the beginning. We call it the tail of the distribution because of extrinsic defects and other gross failure mechanisms. After a certain point, it goes up exponentially. So if you take a large SRAM array on die, let's say a megabyte of array, the voltage for that entire array is limited by the worst bit. So as long as as soon as a few bits start failing, you can't reduce the voltage anymore because that's going to create functional problems. This Vmin, or minimum voltage for the array, also changes from die to die. So it's not the same for all chips. All the design is identical, the process is identical. Because of within die-to-die variations of process, the Vmin changes all over the place for a large number of dies. So when you ship these processors, you are limited by the worst die on top of the worst bit on the die in terms of how low a voltage you can use. Then you have to add voltage margins for soft error, erratic bits, aging-induced degradations I talked about for the SRAM bit, other noises, power supply noises, even at Vmin. So when you add it all up, it's very difficult to scale the overall supply voltage of an array to less than 0.65, 0.7 volts in a scaled process technology. So we need to invoke new techniques to push that Vmin even lower. One of the things that people normally use is trading off Vmin with the array size, or the size of the bits, or the array density overall. So if you make the cells bigger, the transistors bigger in the SRAM cell, you can allow better ratioing of transistors in the cell to provide good stability for read, write, and retention. You have less device mismatches for bigger transistors, less prone to defects when you have bigger transistors. So you can trade off density of the array, SRAM array, versus its Vmin. And that's a technique widely used in the industry for finding the right trade-off balance between density and Vmin. Now, beyond a certain point, when the cell becomes big enough, that doesn't work anymore. So then you have to go to a different kind of cell, and we call it 8-transistor cell, where you decouple the read and write part of the cell. So you can independently optimize the stability of the cell for read and write, and that allows you to go to a lower Vmin at the expense of larger area. So 8-transistor cell consumes more area than a 6-transistor cell. And you can get on the new trajectory for this density versus Vmin trade-off using, for smaller arrays, this 8-transistor kind of cells. One of the goals of design techniques to improve this is to really achieve a better Vmin without compromising density. So that's sort of the metric you have to evaluate any technique against. So it's not just enough to push to lower Vmin at the expense of area, because what matters also is how many bits you can integrate on a die. If you're able to integrate only fewer bits of SRAM on a die, then you have a larger architectural performance loss when you miss a cache and have to go off die to get the data from the DRAM. So you have to come up with techniques that really don't compromise density too much, at the same time achieve significant Vmin reduction. A simplest way you can address that problem first is separate the large last level cache array on the die from the rest of the logic cores. Most of your switching activity happens in the core, logic core, not in the SRAM. The SRAM activity is very low. You access a few bits every cycle. So the most of the power of the chip really goes into the logic core. If you separate the SRAM voltage from the logic core voltage on the die, then you allow the logic core, the more power-hungry part of the design, to be operating at a lower voltage than being limited by the SRAM array's Vmin. So you have a separate voltage SRAM array. It's optimized for the highest value, the lowest bit area that you need to get enough bits on the die. And then you free up the logic code to go to its own vmin, which is much lower than the SRAM vmin, to be able to take advantage of the fact that it is high activity, consumes most of the power. It benefits a lot more overall by being able to go to a lower voltage. So a multi-voltage design that separates the big SRAM arrays from the rest of the logic is the first step in addressing this challenge. You have to insert level shifters between the array and the logic code to allow data communication across multiple voltage domains. You have to have them in the word line for the read and in access data address, and then you have to have on the right side, when you write into the cell, make sure that your data coming from the core gets stepped up to the cell voltage level when you write into the cell. So having embedded level shifters that are power efficient, area efficient, don't pose too much of delay latency overhead in the cache access are very important for this multi-voltage cache design. Now you can take it a step further. If you look at the 6-transistor SRAM cell, it's a weird circuit. It's widely used in the industry because it's the most dense memory cell you can build in a CMOS logic process. It's weird in the sense that if you look at the 6 transistors, you have 2 access devices. Essentially, you're going to read the cell, which is a cross-coupled inverter storing a value, using these access devices. You have to make sure when you read the cell using these devices, you don't disturb the cell. So you need to make sure the read is stable. It doesn't upset the value of the cell because you're pumping current into the cell while trying to read it. So the access devices need to be weak. The NMOS needs to be weak during a read. At the same time, you want to write into the same cell sometimes. So you want to really upset the value of the cell when you want to write into it to change the value. You're using the same NMOS devices, access devices, to write into the cell. And you need them to be strong to be able to successfully write the cell at low voltage. So how can the same device be both strong and weak and change its characteristic between operations? That's not possible. You achieve some of these requirements by ratioing the transistors in the cell. You make the NMOS stronger with respect to the PMOS pull-up to make sure you write OK. You make the NMOS weaker with respect to the pull-down NMOS to make sure you can read without disturbing the cell. So you play these games of sizing the transistors, targeting the process to be so that the transistor has the right strength statically all the time to make this kind of cell work. So, and that, as I said, runs out of gas after some time because there's only so much of that you can do. Now, if you were able to change the strength of these transistors on the fly between read and write, that would be a good thing. And you can use voltage as a knob to do that. So you can modulate the voltage of the transistors, the gate voltage. You can make it weaker during read to make sure it doesn't disturb the cell. And you can collapse the voltage along the cell column to make the PMOSes in the cell weaker during write to make sure you're able to write successfully into the cell. So by doing this dynamic voltage modulation between read and write, you're able to achieve both a stable read and a stable write. And that works pretty well at the expense of additional complexity. You have to worry about a few things when you do that. So for example, when you use word line underdriver low voltage for read, you separate the cell voltage from the word line voltage, and that can create a differential supply noise between those two. They're not tracking each other as closely as they were shorted before. So you have to worry about that impacting the cell stability, because that's a differential mismatch kind of impact on the cell behavior. When you collapse the supply of the column to be able to write into the cell, you have to make sure all the unselected bits in the column, you're only writing in one row, don't lose the data during the time you have collapsed the voltage. So you have to pay attention to the duration of the collapse voltage and the magnitude of the collapse. And you have to program those post-silicon to make sure you're able to improve the write margin without causing a retention problem for the data in the unselected bits in the column. So there's a test chip result showing that if you really use these techniques together optimally, it turns out there's a good window for voltage collapse duration and voltage collapse magnitude that works pretty well. You can improve the bit failure rate for both read and write pretty substantially without causing too much of area overhead, because these tracking circuits and the voltage collapse circuits don't take too much area at the array level. Going from the 60 cell to the 80 cell, where the read and write are decoupled, so it's essentially a more robust cell. There also you can have write and read failures. So you need to boost the voltage of the write word line and read word line to be able to improve the write and read margin of the 8 transistor cells. The second voltage you get for driving these word lines is, it can be a fixed high voltage relay available on the die that's coming in for some other usage on the die, or you can have a local charge pump to boost the voltage up to some extent to allow this read and write margin of the 8T cell to improve. Now, since the charge pump is driving a very small load current, you're simply driving the gate of a transistor of only the word lines on this boost technique. You don't need to be caring too much about the efficiency of the charge pump or the voltage conversion efficiency. So this kind of techniques, we have shown in a test chip that it's pretty effective in reducing the read and write Vmin of 8 transistor cells substantially for large arrays. Now I want to switch to design of the logic blocks. So we talked about the SRAM arrays and the register files, other memory arrays on die, how they limit Vmin and what you can do to improve them. The next frontier for Vmin reduction is logic, the logic code. You want to push that voltage also as low as possible. If you look at the energy per operation or energy per cycle of a logic block versus voltage or frequency, you find that the energy per operation reduces as you reduce voltage from the nominal value, reaches a minimum, and then starts increasing beyond a certain point. So there is a point of operation of voltage frequency where the energy efficiency is maximized for a logic core. Now, for giving that a name or label, we call it near threshold voltage design. As the voltage approaches the threshold voltage of the transistor, further reduction in voltage makes the frequency go down so low, or the cycle time expand so much, that the energy spent per cycle as leakage during the cycle time starts dominating as you keep lowering the voltage. So that's why at this inflection point, what we call this near threshold voltage, the switching and leakage energy per cycle are roughly in balance. So this happens to be the point of operation where the energy efficiency is maximum. So the logic designs need to be able to operate at this maximum energy efficiency point by design to make sure that you're not ruling that out because of functional failures. It's not easy to design a complex processor to be operating at near threshold. You can design a chain of inverters, a small logic, bunch of logic gates. Those are relatively easier to design for near threshold. If you take a complex design, like a Pentium processor, it's old, but it's still pretty complex. It's not as straightforward. So to understand what it takes to design a complex microprocessor to be able to operate at near threshold voltage, which is a point of maximum energy efficiency for logic, we undertook this project where we synthesized the entire Pentium core, about 6 million transistors, using some new near threshold voltage design techniques. We had the L1 data and instruction cache. They're primarily 6 transistor SRAM cells. We wanted them to be put in a separate supply because we are concerned that if you put them on the same supply as the logic core, they will limit the Vmin of the logic core. So we wanted to have a divide and conquer approach to understand that across a complex chip, depending on the circuit type, depending on how many circuits of that type are there, depending on within die variations, different parts of the chip will be at different Vmin when the chip comes back. So instead of designing everything to be operating at low Vmin, which has huge overhead, it's better to smartly divide the design into regions and parts and have independent voltage for this part so that overall, the chip's voltage can be lowered, even though each individual block may not be operating at the minimum point if you pushed everything together. So I'd like to quickly summarize the kind of techniques we used to achieve this near threshold Pentium processor design. Number one, there's some rules of thumb that we learned in doing this. Number one is that avoid wide circuits, avoid high fan-in circuits. When you have high fan-in circuits, your I-on to I-off ratio degrades very quickly at low voltage because the I-off is effectively gets multiplied by the fan-in of the circuit. So effective I-off is the fan-in multiplier, and then you have the I-on, and that ratio degrades as you lower voltage. Second is avoid tall circuits. So don't have too many series connected devices. So we limited to 2. We said no more than 2 series connected devices. As you lower the voltage, the effective I-on of a series connected stack of transistors degrades much faster because you have less VGS across each transistor. You have a body effect-induced threshold increase for the intermediate transistors. So both of these degrade I-on much quicker as you lower voltage, and that creates functional failures. So no wide and no tall circuits. Second, don't forget about the level converter. As I said, to really design a complex processor with capability of near threshold operation overall, you have to have multiple voltage domains. Some of them will be operating at low voltage, where the other ones will be operating at a higher voltage. Now, when you lower the voltage for the block that's operating at low voltage, the level shifter circuit that transfers voltage level from one block to another, that's very prone to failure. Because if you look at the conventional CVSL level shifter, the input NMOS is becoming weaker as you lower voltage from the input side. But the contending PMOS, in the cross-coupled PMOS, remains at a high voltage on the other side, on the output side. So that contention becomes very less favorable, and the circuit can fail very easily. So being able to ratio these transistors properly is one thing. But also you have to drive the load of the next stage from this level shifter circuit. So having a load directly connected to the cross-coupled PMOSes is a bottleneck to improving the delay of this circuit. So you separate the load out, the driving load out from the cross-coupled PMOS point, so that you can independently size that for speed while making sure that the level shifter is robust at low voltages. Few other things we did. In the register file, we realized that regular register files are going to be too much prone to failure. So we had a fully interrupted, much like a flip-flop or latch kind of register file. So it eliminates all contention due to process variations and at low voltages. So that helped. We realized that for the master-slave flip-flop, at really low voltage, the clock edge rate degrades a lot. And you can have significant overlap between the master clock closing and the slave clock opening. And then the slave can write into the master because of process variations and mismatches. So you had an inverter inserted between the master and slave at the expense of some delay to make sure the slave can never corrupt the master during data transfer. One of the biggest challenges we had was a timing convergence, both for min delay failures as well as max delay failures for this kind of a design at low voltage. If you apply a nominal timing convergence tool and methodology, that doesn't really work very well at low voltage for two reasons. Number one is that when you look at the interconnect RC paths at nominal voltage, when you optimize with repeaters, the RC path part of the delay roughly matches the gate part of the delay, repeater delay. That's a rough optimization. Now that's true at the nominal voltage. As you go to low voltage, the gate delay, the transistor delay for the repeater increases a lot, but the RC delay of the interconnect doesn't change much. So you have an imbalance of your repeater design at low voltage. So any optimization you do for long repeater lines is suboptimal if you did that at nominal voltage, if you're going to operate this at low voltage. The second one is more subtle. When you look at the impact of random variations on the delay characteristic of a chain of gates in your critical path, at nominal voltage, the delay is roughly linearly proportional to changes in VT and other parameters of the transistor. So if you have a random variation along a path, that gets nicely averaged out because the delay is linear with variations. At low voltage, the delay changes exponentially with variations because you're entering the subthreshold or near threshold region of the transistor. So when you have exponential variation of delay with parameter variation, you no longer get the nice averaging of random variations across a path that you get at nominal voltage. So you need to account for the effect of random variations very differently at low voltage using statistics of variations and the right delay dependence on the device parameters to get the right critical path sizing and design and meet your max delay targets. The third thing, of course, obviously, is min delay failure. Your clock edges really become very problematic at low voltage. They become very slow. You have the hold time of the flip-flops and latches. They become much larger at low voltage. So you have to account for min delay functional failures also very differently at low voltage than what you do at nominal voltage. So we developed or enhanced the regular timing convergence tools and methodologies to really cover a design that's being designed for NTV kind of operation. So before I tell you how good the results were, I want to share a marketing slide which says, just to capture your attention on how well did we do in terms of getting a Pentium processor to operate at NTV. To amplify the value of that, we actually built a system where we had the Pentium processor fully powered by ambient light, a table lamp shining on it, with a solar cell. So there was no power supply to the Pentium processor at all. It was all powered by a solar cell using a table lamp inside the lab. And we booted Windows and Linux and all operating systems, ran all applications relatively okay, without any problem on this NTV Pentium processor using a solar-powered design. If you look at the power performance measurements, the performance goes all the way from 3 megahertz to about 1 gigahertz for the Pentium processor across a range of voltages. The power is about 2 milliwatts at 3 megahertz frequency. That's pretty low power for a full-scale PC processor like the Pentium. Notice that we were, it was good that we designed the chip for the memory to be on a separate voltage rail than the logic. As you see in the gray axis label, the on-die L1 cache fails at 0.55 volts, where the processor core, the Pentium core, goes all the way to 280 millivolts. So had we not separated the processor and the core and the memory voltage rails, we would have had to stop everything at 0.55 volts. We won't be able to go to as low as 280 millivolts for the rest of the core and getting the corresponding power benefit. So divide and conquer for a complex NTV design is a very valuable approach. If you look at where does the energy efficiency peak, in super threshold, you're dominated by switching energy, as expected. In sub-threshold, your leakage energy of logic and memory dominates. In near threshold, which is where the energy efficiency is the maximum, you get about 0.45 volts of operating voltage. And the leakage and switching energy are roughly in balance. You have 40% leakage, 60% switching. If you look at the entire energy versus voltage curve, you find that you get about 5x improvement in the energy efficiency from the nominal voltage by operating at NTV. And again, the leakage and switching energy are roughly in balance. So how is it useful? When you're running something that needs really high performance, you want to operate at a high voltage, high frequency. Sometimes you'll even operate there and shut it down to save power. When your required performance is well below the NTV operating point, frequency is much less, you will operate at the NTV point, which is the point of maximum energy efficiency, finish the work sooner than required, even at NTV point, and then shut down. Right? Sometimes you are not able to shut down a building block or a processor because you're not sure when you have to wake up and how quickly you have to wake up to service the next set of workload that's coming in. So those missed opportunities can be addressed by parking the processor in the NTV state. Because the NTV state is very low power, very low energy. So you can use it as a parking, and it's alive. The processor is not gone to sleep, so it's waking up is much quicker. So by having a parking feature, where you park it in the NTV state when you're not sure how quickly you have to wake up to service the next thing, allows you to take advantage of these missed opportunities for shutting down and waking up, and overall reduces the power consumption. And finally, if you have a highly parallel workload, as I talked about, you need to design a large number of blocks for operating in parallel, each operating at NTV, because that's your point of maximum energy efficiency, while meeting the throughput requirement of the workload by just going parallel that you desire. So you're trading off area cost, because to integrate more processors in parallel takes more silicon area. But with Moore's law scaling, silicon area is becoming much more affordable to get much better energy efficiency. And that's a fair trade-off for many applications, so many workloads, to trade off the area affordable transistors that are available with Moore's law scaling with the extreme energy efficiency target that you have for your platform. Variability plays a big role in your NTV operating point, much bigger than what you expect at nominal voltage. So I want to stress that NTV is not a single voltage operating point, although people talk about it as one. If you take a design and run different things on it, and run at different process corners, run at different process queues, you find that the NTV point shifts all over the place. So it's not a single operating point. Now, example of that is shown here, that the same design in the same process, but 3 different process queues, slow, medium, and fast. Slow is low leakage, fast is higher leakage. You see the NTV point varies. So the best energy efficiency point comes at the slow process corner, but at the cost of 30% performance loss. So if you were to make up for that by going more parallel, you'll need 30% more computing blocks to be in parallel to make up for that and get the target performance. So it's very critical to do an NTV design with the process in mind. to target the process optimally along with your NTV design targets to make sure that you're overall achieving the right balance between the nominal performance and the NTV energy efficiency and the amount of area cost you have to pay if you want to go parallel. Okay, that's important. Second thing is that even for a same process, same design, the NTV point can vary for multiple cores on the same die. If you have a many-core processor, not all of these cores will have the same NTV operating point. So it's important to have mapping techniques to profile the core's NTV power performance profiles, and so that you can map your application, the threads, and what have you, optimally to this ensemble of cores which have widely different NTV operating points because of within die process variations. You have to have die-to-die bidding techniques because not all dies will be at the same NTV operating point, although you design them to be the same, or they're in the same process. So binning techniques, core mapping techniques, process targeting are critical for achieving at a system level the best energy efficiency using NTV. The NTV operating point shifts during runtime. So as your temperature changes, for example, your leakage changes, and NTV, as you know, is a balance of switching and leakage. So as leakage changes because of temperature, your NTV operating point shifts. If you have a workload running with lower activity, the balance between switching and leakage power changes. Lower activity means lower switching power effectively. So again, the NTV point shifts based on what you're running. So at runtime, you have to have monitors and control mechanisms to set the right NTV operating point depending on what's running, what's the environment, and so on. It's very important to have techniques to implement as little idle power as possible. Anything that's idle, not working, is leaking, and that impacts your NTV operating point. So having fine-grained shutdown activation mechanisms really is critical for fully utilizing the NTV design capability. And finally, you need to make sure that you're not over-designing for a voltage much lower than the expected range of NTV points. Because anytime you design with a lower voltage than that, you're paying some overhead. You're paying some area overhead, you're paying some capacitance overhead, which hurts you at a nominal performance point. So balancing the Vmin targets with your expected range of NTV operating points for the design and the platform is absolutely essential to make sure the overall design is very, very efficient. I'm going to quickly go through some of the other challenges related to dynamic variations, not just process variations that I talked about. There are 4 variations you have to worry about that are environmental or dynamic. Number 1 is supply noises, IR drops, inductive voltage droops, load line variations. Second is temperature changes, because the amount of heat you generate on the die changes. Aging. In the beginning of life, things are much faster, can operate at lower voltage. Towards the end of life, because of aging degradations, they become slower, need higher voltage. You need to, we sort of guard band these things, margin these things in our design to make sure throughout the lifetime things are error-free. And the final one is path activity. So not every cycle you activate the most critical path. Not every cycle you have multiple input switching to a complex gate simultaneously to create the largest delay. Not every cycle do you have coupling in the worst possible way between 2 neighboring interconnects to slow down them in the opposite direction. So all of these things happen on a cycle-by-cycle basis depending on what's running. So by assuming worst case, again, for all of these 4 things, we're paying a significant penalty in terms of overall voltage frequency guard band and penalty in performance and efficiency. So we need techniques to address these going forward. Show you a couple of examples. The voltage droop, and we have measured this in some systems, happens once in a billion cycles, 1 billion with a big B. And we set that voltage droop margin throughout the operation of the processor, which is a huge penalty. So if you had a mechanism to detect these voltage droops on the fly and lower the frequency as the droops occur to adapt to the droop, and then as the droop goes away, after a short time, you go back to the original frequency and voltage. By doing that, you're not paying this huge penalty all the time. So your average performance goes up tremendously. So having mechanisms for detecting droops, detecting temperature changes, and having corrective or adaptive mechanisms by frequency change is a good thing for getting much better average performance and efficiency. So this is a chip that we implemented that allows you to change frequency very quickly without having to relog the PLL, having 3 PLL system that responds to a voltage droop, slows down temporarily, and goes back up once the droop goes away. Same thing you can do for aging, you can do for temperature changes, and so on. So the adaptive techniques are quite helpful in addressing that. And going beyond that, when you allow errors to occur because of voltage droops or temperature changes or frequency changes, but to detect them and seamlessly correct them without the user or the system being aware of that the fact that the error happened. Then you can also push these limits much farther. So this is OpenSpark core we designed a while back, which has a 7-stage pipeline. We had embedded error detection sequentials, much like the work done in Michigan, the Razor technique. We had some improvements on the implementation of that. Also, you had tunable replica circuits to track critical path error changes, delay changes, much less intrusively and with less overhead. So implemented all of these techniques with adaptive clock control and error recovery by replay along the pipeline for a reasonably good processor, the OpenSpark processor, to see what kind of benefit you can get by having resiliency built in at a circuit level on top of adaptation. And I show you the data here for a particular workload. It's an edge detect program. You give an input image, it detects the edges of the image. So we ran this once with resiliency turned on and resiliency turned off. So when resiliency is turned off, you can see the output is much more corrupted. All the errors are visible. When resiliency is turned on, you're able to push voltage frequency a lot more aggressively without the error showing up in the final result of this program. So by doing this, you can get significant benefits in throughput and energy efficiency by pushing the limits of voltage and frequency. Finally, I want to quickly touch on the interconnect side. So we talked about compute in most of the talk, but the data movement is a killer. Data movement consumes as much or more of the energy in a system than just doing the compute. So the thing with data movement is that for interconnects, the faster you want to go, the longer distance you want to go over a lossier channel, the more energy is spent in transmission and reception. So a picojoules per bit, which is a good measure of energy efficiency of interconnects, much like picojoule per flop you had for compute, distance, channel losses, and data rates, they all significantly impact the interconnect energy efficiency. And you have to address all three of these together with the transceiver circuits as well as the channel, which is the transmission medium, to get the best improvement in overall data movement efficiency. Two approaches to that. One is 3D, three-dimensional stacking of dies using through-silicon vias, typically being promoted for integrating logic and memory together. So memory is a big part of our interconnect data movement. We go off die to memory all the time to get new data into the processor. So bringing the DRAM and the CPU much closer together using this, instead of DDR or LPDDR, using a wide I/O kind of techniques where you have lots and lots of very short connections at low cost. So you don't have much losses across the stubs. You don't have a long distance to go to. Your data rates can be relatively low because you care about the aggregate bandwidth. And since you have lots of these, then you can get a pretty high aggregate bandwidth with each link or each stub operating at relatively low voltage and frequency. So that's a technique that can really improve the communication bottleneck to the main memory and even storage. The other one is for longer distance communications. So when you go across a data center or across racks in a server, you have to worry about in electrical connections over long distance have a lot more interferences, a lot lossier. You have a lot more discontinuities in the channel, going from package to board and back and through connectors and all that. So by going optical, optical is much more robust over longer distance communication for losses and interferences. So for long distances, optical can be a good mechanism for improving data movement efficiency. So for optical, the key challenges are the component reliability, the laser sources, integration of the components in a low-cost way, making sure the conversions from electrical, optical, and back are not imposing too much of energy or latency overheads. There's a lot of work going on in silicon photonics, for example, if you've heard of, that tries to integrate many of the optical components much closer to the CPU, sometimes even on the die, on the silicon die, to really allow much more efficient optical interconnects across large distances in a data center. So with that, I'd like to finish with summarizing the 5 pillars of achieving extreme energy efficiency. Clearly, the compute needs to be extremely energy efficient, but that's not enough. You have to have fine-grained power management at a platform and system level to take advantage of the different workloads and the kind of different things you need to do at different times. The memory and storage subsystem is extremely critical. Data movement from that to the compute blocks is critical. Self-aware computation, aware of the adaptation and resiliency for dealing with environmental and workload changes. And finally, don't ignore the software, because a lot of this can only be leveraged if the software is optimized through compiler work, through programming work, to run optimally on this kind of systems. So that's a key area of research as well for achieving this extreme energy efficiency. So with that, I think I'm done. I think time for a question or so, maybe? Yeah, maybe not. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, let's open it up to questions. Right in the back.
Do you have an idea what's going to end CMOS scaling and what happens then?
From physics and technology point of view, we don't see a limit, at least to the end of the decade and even into the next one. I think what will determine whether it can continue at the same rate is the economics of it. So each generation needs a huge amount of investment to, exponentially more than the previous generation to get to the next generation. And whether the investment can be afforded by the industry as a whole or can be afforded by individual companies in the industry will sort of dictate the pace of the scaling going forward. It's not so much any technical challenges.
Any other questions? So I have one. So when we're pushing for 2 orders of magnitude, well, there's a need for 2 orders of magnitude improvement in energy efficiency. Yet if we look at the Landauer limit, we're many orders of magnitude off from that. Can you share your insight on whether that's really going to come through primarily new technologies or entirely just new models of computing based on what you're seeing at Intel?
I think the Landauer limit is way out there. I mean, I don't think anybody even dreaming that you can get there, at least in my lifetime. But I think that main thing we are, I think the main thing we deal with is variations and noises. And fundamentally, if you forget the Landauer limit for now, the thermal noise is the one that finally limits you. So, and we, to get to a cryogenic kind of operation, for example, people explored that. The amount of energy you have to pump to get there is not, overall you're much less energy efficient. So clearly from energy efficiency point of view overall, reducing temperature is not affordable. Simply, the energy cost is too much. So given that we'll be operating in normal temperatures for most of our future systems, I think the thermal limit is the fundamental limit there for regular von Neumann computing systems, right? And then, but way above that are all the extrinsic factors that limit you. The moment you have a large aggregation of components, the extrinsic factors play a more dominant role than intrinsic factors. So I think we have a long way to get to the intrinsic from the overcoming the extrinsic, and which a lot of the talked about the extrinsic effects you have to deal with to reduce the voltage and get to the thermal limit. And then beyond that, if you have a different kind of computing paradigm like quantum computing, I don't think it'll be happening so much for energy efficiency. It'll be happening because it solves unsolvable problems in a new way, and there the energy is not the metric; it's a metric of solvability. Whether you have a solution, some of the crypto prime factorization problems, for example, in security. So quantum computer, even if you have 5 of them in the world, that's probably what you need, because that pretty much makes all the public encryption algorithms invalid. So which means you have to redo the whole security stack from scratch, because that becomes fully vulnerable. So solving this kind of problems that even the biggest supercomputer in the future cannot handle will probably cause a paradigm shift to some new kind of machine, but I don't think that will be on everybody's desk. So it will be something that you do for solving big problems.
Thanks. Any others? All right, let's thank the speaker.